the simple title sheet for the second of two 2-hour tapes for the Free Venice Beachhead's 20th anniversary. The first issue came out in December 1968. A number of people attended this videotaping, and some who were contacted couldn't make it. The second half of this tape is of very terrible footage, but important actually. At the Sidewalk Cafe, the 17th of November 1988, among the many events that I produced and realized for the Beachhead's 20th anniversary, that night at the Sidewalk Cafe, the 17th of November 1988, the stellar Carol Fondiller was headlined with Paul Krassner and Danny Peck as a benefit for the Beachhead at the Sidewalk Cafe on the Oceanfront Walk.
Hello, my name is Linda Lux. We're here today on October 9th, 1988 to celebrate 20 years of the Beachhead Collective, wonderful Venice newspaper that's been in existence for 20 years, and all of us sitting here today have been part of that effort, and some still are. Some of us were here a long time ago. This is the second in a series of Beachhead tapes, and we're going to begin by having each member here today speak about their own experiences, what they thought most important, very personal things about their feelings about the Beachhead. And we're going to begin, to my left, with Memphis Slim.
I came out here about 8 years ago. I've been on the Beachhead Collective now about 7 years. I've been involved in the so-called alternative press since 1970. I was a member of the Great Speckled Bird Collective in Atlanta, Georgia, and much to mine and many people's chagrin, I was a staff member when the Great Speckled Bird published its very last issue. I heard about the Free Venice Beachhead from some friends who moved to Venice, California in the middle 70s, and when I got the opportunity to work in Los Angeles, I moved to Venice. I immediately saw my first issue of the Beachhead and was hooked. I have admired the Beachhead for a number of years before I came onto the collective and before I saw the first issue. It is truly an anachronism, and yet in a way it's a real expression of the uniqueness of the Venice community. There really is no other place in America that could produce a paper of this kind, especially of this longevity. The best thing, I guess, that's ever happened to me on the Beachhead, many things have happened that were really wonderful, but probably meeting my wife, the woman that I later married, is probably the best thing that ever happened to me. The worst thing is something I'd rather not even mention because it involves somebody who's was once near and dear and worked very hard on the Beachhead and just has a few too many personal problems. Anyway, I'm grateful to be here.
Hi, my name's Kathy Sullivan, and I write under the name of Alice Cramden on the Venice Beachhead. And the way I got involved in the Beachhead basically is I had just gotten out of film school, and I was knocking around Hollywood trying to get a job. I was trying to support 2 kids, and eventually a lot of things went sour, that, you know, and trying to do all of that. And I came out here back to my roots because I'm from Santa Monica, Venice, the border, and I moved to Venice, and I saw the Beachhead at Dave's Market, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to keep my hand in writing, and so I decided, well, I'm going to go to a meeting, you know, and I noticed when they had their meeting, they said, we need volunteers. So one Saturday, I was going past the Venice Fox, and I remembered that that's where the Beachhead met, and I went to my first meeting, and I was just amazed. The way they put the paper together, the way people just remembered things. No one in those days had a pencil or paper. They just kept figures together. They kept in their mind the articles, and it was just, I was just overwhelmed, and I thought I could never learn how to do this. But I stayed on, and then of course I met Memphis Slim, who later became my husband, and that was probably the high point. And also, the Beachhead has a history of community activity, and that really appealed to me. Venice was like a small town in a big city, and anywhere you went, there was always someone you would bump into, and it was a real good feeling, a secure feeling that, you weren't just this little speck in a big world. There were a lot of people there, and they believed like you did, and it was the community involvement that really appealed to me. And also the idea of slow growth, which was a tradition here in Venice, and which I think had a lot to do with the politics now in LA, the slow growth initiatives and all of that, and I think it started here in Venice, and I'm really proud of it.
My name's Lynn Bronstein. I don't actually live in Venice, but in Santa Monica. And I was reading the Beachhead for years before I got involved with it. Even when I lived in the Valley, I was picking up the paper whenever I came down to Venice. Then when I moved to Santa Monica, I decided to start contributing some poetry to the paper now and then. And after a few months of that, I was in touch with a member of the collective who suggested that I get more involved and write more frequently, because she really wanted to see my writing in the paper more, and she said everybody else did too. And so then about 6 months after that, I realized I had the time to join the collective, so I did. And I was on the collective from mid-'79 to late 1980, took a hiatus and came back in 1982, and was on the paper staff again until mid-1983, and then left again. But all along for 10 years I've been writing for the paper, articles and poetry. And I have never gotten tired of doing that once or twice a year, to write an article for the paper and to keep in touch with the people on the staff. See, to me as a writer, the Beachhead has been almost a dream come true, because even though I don't get a fee for the articles I write, I can pretty much say what I want, which no other publication has ever let me do. They don't give me any limitations on style or on content, and even when I've had a very strong opinion, even when other members of the collective didn't agree with my opinion, they didn't censor it. So that's always a very liberating thing for a person who's involved in something creative. But more than that, the times when I was on the collective and involved in the collective process, I learned some other things about myself. I learned that I could do things that I didn't think I would be able to do, and nobody was going to tell me that that's not on a professional level. Even if I didn't think I was very good at doing paste up on the paper, I was given the opportunity to do that, the opportunity to spec type, the opportunity to do something that I don't like to do, which is to collect bills for advertising. But everybody got a chance to do these things, and everybody got a chance also to, in a way, officiate, because the job of managing, being like the managing editor of the paper, except it was called the coordinator, was passed around from month to month, and everybody involved got a chance to be coordinator, even if they had never thought of themselves as a leadership person. So I had a chance to do that too, and when I found people didn't keep quiet, I just took out my police whistle and blew it so I could restore order. And this is really democracy in action, which no other publication anywhere has ever given people a chance to do, except for other papers run in that matter. And I think Marge Piercy's vision in Women on the Edge of Time of a futuristic society where people do things collectively is fulfilled at the Beachhead more than anywhere I know in the present society we live in. So I have very happy memories of my involvement with the paper. If I'm not as involved as I was, it's because you do get involved in some other things too. But I still find it a real rewarding place to go and bring my writing, and a real rewarding bunch of people keep coming onto the paper. So I keep meeting new wonderful people too.
Hi, I'm Linda Lux again, and I joined the Beachhead sometime in '74, I believe, somewhere around 1974. I had just moved to Venice. I was a single mother with 2 children, and I wanted to get involved locally. I had always been involved where I lived, and somebody, and I for the life of me cannot remember who, invited me to a Beachhead meeting. It was at Milton Takai's apartment on Breeze. And I've been racking my brain. I've asked Carol. We can't remember who took me there, but there was Gail Williamson and Jim Zane and Milton Takai and Carol, and I was the fifth at that time. And the reason that I loved it is that because it was a collective. I'd never experienced anything like that before, or since, for that matter, that everyone shared equally in the good and the bad, the chores and the high points. We all were editors. We all were ad buyers, sellers. We all, well, I was the only one with a car at that point, so I had the wonderful job of driving to Sunland once a month to take the paper to be printed, and then later to Koreatown. There was a Korean paper at one point that was printing. So unfortunately that was not too collective, but it was the way it was. What I loved most, well, lots of things I loved most. I loved the fairness and the lack of hierarchy, and the fact that everyone was accepted for who they were and what they had to contribute, and there was no putting people down for anything. Everyone's abilities were accepted. I never considered myself a writer, but I didn't feel that I had to be a writer to be on the Beachhead. I did write a few things, but I felt like what I had to contribute was equally important, and we spent 3 years laying the paper out and meeting at my house on my living room floor. There's glue marks. There were glue marks all over the rug. And there were some wonderful memories. I was thinking about the most scary time, I think, that ever happened was when we had this huge argument, and we argued about lots of things, about what got in and what didn't, but we put in a poem that was printed in the Berkeley Barb about the SLA during the whole SLA episode, and somehow we agreed to print it. I was afraid the FBI was going to come storming in my house. That's the only time I was really afraid, because it was a pretty flagrant article. Radical, yes. And I remember the parties. We had lots of Beachhead parties at my house, and those were wonderful. And we never missed a month, no matter what. And we often were attacked editorially. People thought they didn't really understand that we really judged each article on its merit, not on its politics, per se. We really had an editorial value system that was quite high, and if it was poorly written, no matter who wrote it, we would often not accept it, and we didn't edit anything. We accepted everything the way it was written. So various Venice factions would often attack us at the time for being not politically appropriate or not politically correct, but we really didn't turn anything down on a political basis. It was all on the editorial, and we felt very proud of. I'm still very proud when I think of the high level of integrity that we brought to it. And just talking about it brings up all these wonderful feelings. Another memory is that Carol and I were really getting very tired at that time. After 3 years or so that I had been on, Carol had been on longer, and we didn't feel that we could quit. We really needed a break, but we found a man who was just starting to get involved locally named Arnold Springer, who was my neighbor, and we kind of started recruiting him very nicely for a couple of months and invited him to a meeting here and a meeting there, and finally we got him to agree to join. So we had him stay on for a month or so, and then we casually took our exit and retreated, and we knew we left it in good hands.
It was the up for grabs issue, right?
That was after we left. Beachhead up for grabs, that's right. And that reminds me, the most fun that we had during the whole time was thinking of the titles and pasting them down. We had such a good time. It made everything worth it. And I think my favorite article at the time, I think all of Carol's articles were brilliant, but my favorite one that still is in my mind was written by Pam Emerson, called The Social Ecology of Venice. And if any of you haven't read it, it's worth looking back up. It really described what's going on in Venice, and this was, at least in probably 1976 or 7, it was a wonderful article. It was about growth and so forth. Go ahead. Now I'm going to introduce Ed Ferrar.
Hi, I'm Ed Ferrar, and I guess the first copy of the Beachhead that I ever saw was about 1968 when I was living on 6th and Santa Clara. And it didn't appear very regularly at that time. And I think from when I'm talking with Steve and John, they've told me that I think that
that they first formed the Venice Survival Committee, that then moved to the Venice Defense Committee, and finally to Free Venice. And that's why Free Venice is on the masthead, because it's a great evolution of the voice that sort of sprang up from the oppression that we were really getting at that time in '68, when the city was winning and thought they could just run over Venice. And I'm amazed that the Venice Beachhead is still around and that Venice is still something like what I can still live here and remember and value and so forth and so on. Let's see. I've never been a member of the collective, I don't think. I think I've been on the masthead here and there. People have put my name on there because I've always been around and sort of helped out different collectives, because it's been up for grabs several times. And it's amazing to me, well, how it has really maintained itself. You know, these values that that made the '60s the magical place, and Venice was definitely magical then, and it's still magical now, and are still here. In fact, I often think of that people come to Venice and think that this is the best place they've ever known, and I just sort of look and realize they never knew the Venice I knew, but you know, here in America, it probably is one of the better places to live in the world. So I don't know what else to say.
My name is Lance Diskan, and I also have never officially been a member of the collective, although I've done paste up on occasion and layout and distribution, and my prose and my poetry and my photographs have all been in the paper over the years, and my interviews. When I first came to Venice, Volume 1, Number 2 had just hit the streets that day. It was the second issue of the Beachhead. At that time, it was still published on green recycled paper. It was put together at a place on West Washington by, I don't know if Earl Newman owned that at that time. I think it was Earl's studio. And Steve Clare and John Haig were involved in publishing those early issues. That's how it began with me and the Beachhead. I would say some of my favorite times over the years have been Carol's writings. It's not necessarily an exact article or an exact point in time as much it is her comment and her perspective on things over the years. That's been an ongoing enjoyment. My worst moment has to do with the hat. That my hat is part of my Beachhead history. This is my Viper in the bosom of the community hat, and this is the Viper, and Venice is the community, and I'm the Viper. And I was denounced thusly in the Beachhead for having the audacity to write an article saying that people should be polite and realistic in dealing with this political administration, and for that I was denounced. So that maybe was the low point, or a classic low spot. I'm also amazed that the paper still exists after 20 years, and I hope that all the people who have been part of the collective, and I believe that all the people who have been part of the collective over the years, wherever they are now, are part of the Beachhead's victory and its celebration to continue to exist, and the protection of the values that all those people have devoted themselves to over the years.
Hello, my name is Pat McCartney, although I wrote a few articles about art under the nom de plume of Eddie Ogoy. I lived in Los Angeles just about all my life, but didn't move to Venice until 1973, when I became a intermittent reader of the Beachhead and appreciated very much its alternative point of view to the mainstream journalism in Los Angeles. In 1984, I was writing some freelance articles, not altogether successfully, and the Beachhead printed 2 consecutive appeals to the community. Help, we're going under,
we're dying, please, if you care at all, come out, help. I attended a meeting. I dragged a neighbor friend of mine to the meeting, and approximately 35 new members showed up at that first meeting. And because of the tempestuous nature of the existing collective at the time, within 6 months the new members have been pared down to 3. And within a year there was only two survivors of those 35 people. I think that says something about the nature of a volunteer newspaper and the type of experience that one has in a collective volunteer situation. Sometimes it can be difficult to withstand the individual temperaments and egos and agendas that come into a volunteer situation. And if one can survive that, then it can be a very rewarding experience, and you eventually can become the difficult temperamental insider and either welcoming or scaring off new members. There were a lot of high points in the 4 years that I served on the collective. I've recently departed being a regular member because I took a job down in San Diego County working for a newspaper. But I can remember many instances where I was extremely proud of what individuals were saying in the Beachhead. I can remember articles by people outside the collective, some of Lynn Bronstein's writing, Lance's interview with Ken Kesey, Jeff Cohen's letters from Europe when he traveled to Venice, Italy, and the countless articles by people who were on the staff that either stirred up the community or expressed things that everybody wanted to say that few people were saying in the mainstream publications. Then a little more than a year ago, I think the Beachhead played a small but important role in a city council election. And we actually received some attention by the rest of the community about our repeated attacks on our 17-year incumbent councilwoman. It was a delightful time in the Beachhead's history that I had the privilege of sharing. I'd like to say that I never got what I wanted out of the Beachhead. I was a implacable advocate for reform on the Beachhead. I wanted to see some change, but any volunteer organization that has survived 20 years as the Beachhead has wrapped itself in a thick layer of custom and tradition. And it was personally extremely frustrating at times to have arguments settled by someone eventually saying, well, we've never done that before, or, well, we once did that, and that was the end of the discussion.
I declined to mention my name because it really is unimportant. And basically, I found the Beachhead here in about 1977 when I first moved to California and thought that Venice would be the only logical place for people in Los Angeles to live because it was next to the ocean. And since that time I found out, and I have lived in all different parts of Los Angeles, mainly because I can't afford to live in Venice. And so I have a lot of mixed feelings about the nature of the community and the paper. I kind of agree with Pat in the sense that there's so much custom and tradition that's not necessarily easy for persons outside of the knowledge of this area to break into the group. I always try to encourage the group to expand and to allow more kinds of people to come in, especially minorities, quote unquote minorities. I feel like it's a very white group, and that's a problem to me. As far as newspapers are concerned, my first experience in alternative paper was when they tried to draft me back in 1968, and in my high school we immediately started an underground newspaper in Wisconsin. So and in Wisconsin there was quite a movement all across the state at that time for people to do things without the official approval. So for me it's been a long custom to do writings and to do politicking without approval of the government or whoever's in power. But I think what I basically like to say positive in favor of the Beachhead is that, like almost everybody else, I think that there's a great effort made for people to not censor other people's words and writings. And because of my own involvements in my life, I have found that free speech is probably the greatest weapon that we have in this country in order to make changes. And free speech in writing, of course, is one vehicle. I think it's limited now because so few people read. That's another criticism I have of the Beachhead, is it doesn't have, I don't feel it has a wide readership. But because people put such an emphasis on allowing a person to speak forth exactly what they feel and then talk about it, I have to respect this paper, and it's the reason I wanted to.
Wrote during my 4 years who did not make today's taping, and in particular I'd like to commend Jack Weinroth and Jim Prickett for their contributions to the Beachhead. I think both of them added a real brilliance to the Beachhead in their contributions. I think that some of Jim Prickett's articles especially were as good as anything the paper's ever published. And I believe Jim got an award for one of the pieces.
Story of the year in 1986 for his president is Pusher.
The article of his that I remember the most was the article in which he said that, which he compared the Contras, which had been described by Reagan as the moral equivalent of our founding fathers, and he compared the Contras to our founding fathers, and our founding fathers came up short. But Jim, who is a historian, could tell that type of story as few people could.
Let me read the list of names of people who were supposed to be here today but aren't, and I'd like to read their names. We've met the people who are. Olga Palo, Diane Nicholson, Sarah Omari, Wendy Rowe, Beth Miller, and Judith Martin. I don't know what it was like after I left, but when our decisions were made always by consensus. I'd like to know if that ever changed. We could argue for hours, but we ultimately had to have consensus before anything was printed, which was, we had consensus, which means everyone. So we all had to agree. It was all or nothing, and we had some arguments, but no one in my memory, I don't remember people being denounced. I think we were, in our time it was, there were the people with humor and the people that had no humor. That was our biggest problem. We all felt we were political, and we all felt the same way, but those of us on the paper thought we had some humor. we had a hard time with the humorless group. But it was by consensus. I'd like some comment about if it had changed, if it was other ways.
Well, what I remember when I came on, and that was when, let's see, Olga Palo and Elizabeth Elder and Mo Stabneser, and who else was? No, Arnold had just left about the time I came on. And I remember that we voted according to a majority. It wasn't a consensus. And there were periodic purges with different, egos clashing and things like that. And that's the only thing that I remember, as being a negative aspect. Otherwise, the Beachhead was really...
I'm Diane Nicholson. I'm always late, and he's always stealing my punchlines or something. I've been on the collective for a little over 4 years now. I've been reading the Beachhead since its inception. I was recruited by Emily Winters, one of our friends, Amelia America, and I found out later it was because basically she wanted to leave, and I've learned since then that in the spirit of things, you don't leave unless you can leave someone behind to help carry on with the whole thing. And she very sneakily got to know me over a year and a half and found out just by coincidence that I used to work on my high school and college newspapers and edited the Venice High School Oarsman, and all that, and had been around here forever. So when I walked upstairs back then, 4 years ago, some odd, we were at the Fox Venice, and I walked in the room and saw these wonderful people sitting around yelling at each other and grinning and sleeping and said, well, I'm home. I think I belong here, and promptly sat around and listened and watched and tried to learn for the next several months before I even had the guts to come out of the haze long enough to actually try my hand at layout again and writing an article. Fortunately, tongue-in-cheek, a house around the corner from me burnt down, so that was my initial article in the Beachhead. You know, I reported on how well managed that was. Since then, I've become really good friends with a lot of people I've never imagined I'd have encountered. I'd sort of given up and thought the dream had possibly passed, and thanks to the Beachhead, it hasn't, in large part. I feel that Beachhead past and present, and hopefully future, because we're looking for new energy all the time, will carry the banner and the spirit of Venice as we once knew it and as still exists here. And I'm just real proud to be part of it. And I'm trying harder and harder to be on time all the time. And I'd like to say something. Since I was late, I didn't get to hear too much about previous comments. But in terms of some of our differences, as 1980s as this may sound, it could be economics, it could just be money. If the Beachhead had more money and could have more pages, we could have more of what everybody wants, okay? More local politics, more international stuff, more yammer and drivel and plop and all the kind of stuff, and plenty of poetry and lots of graphics. So if anybody sees this and feels like it, give us some money.
This is now 1988, and because of the rise of organized street thuggery over illicit drugs, there's now actually debate going on in this country about legalizing drugs. And although I have mixed feelings about legalizing some of the drugs that are being discussed, or in fact are primarily responsible for the organized crime that is developing just like during Prohibition. Specifically, that means crack cocaine. I think that the Beachhead is a wonderful example of why marijuana should be legalized. Where else can you smoke a joint and drink a beer at 11 o'clock on a Sunday and feel normal? But then Beachhead meetings. And I think that the laws against marijuana are silly, are unnecessary, are destructive, have made criminals out of entire generations of otherwise very decent people, creative communities. I've yet to see anybody in the street because of pot. I see legions of people in the street because of alcohol, our legal drug, and from other types of illegal drugs. But I just thought I'd comment on that haze and trust that this videotape will never be turned over to the Los Angeles Police Department.
I would just like to add, though, that for the other side's perspective, those who have not wanted to partake of drugs, of any controlled substances of any sort, have never been forced to do so by other collective members, which proves that peer pressure is not that strong. It is possible to say no. No, you know, if you want to, it's okay, and if you don't want to, it's okay, as long as you are not disruptive in either sense. I just want to add that for the benefit of those people who put out little TV shows like the Flintstone Kids Say No to Drugs that prove that all you have to do is say no and everybody will accept you. I don't know about the Flintstone Kids, but the Beachhead kids are like that.
Just to finish that, when I was involved with the Beachhead, I was also the LA coordinator for Normal. And we didn't do those things during meetings. We was not to publish their things, but as I said, it was all done by consensus. And we loved poetry. We also had, for a time, two graphic artists, cartoonists on staff. Bryce Wood, who designed the current masthead, and after Bryce, a man by the name of Roy, and I can't remember Roy's last name. Does anyone remember Roy's last name? But they would do original cartoons for the paper. We also received, and I don't know if you still do, but alternative press syndicate. I would get to pick up the mail. I got to
Linda,
read.
the Alternative Press Syndicate has been out of business
It's
for
been
about
okay.
a year and a half.
It was wonderful because we would trade newspapers with all the other alternative papers across the country. So we would kind of use their graphics. We'd use the APS graphics. So we had lots of graphics, and that was also fun, chosen by consensus what we would put in and what we wouldn't. So who would like to comment on the selection process?
As I said, I'd worked in a number of collective situations prior to the Beachhead. When I came to the Beachhead, the political sophistication of the collective members was extremely high. I know I got told several times there is no correct line on the Beachhead. Well, I've always felt there is a correct line. It's very broad, but basically there is one. What we did was we had, by that time in the evolution of the paper, had a policy whereby a majority of people could determine an article to be published in the Beachhead unless someone had what was called a principled objection. And for about 2 years, my first 2 years on the paper.
Comments? Yes.
I just wanted to add that the priority on articles were usually articles about Venice because it was a community paper. And when I first arrived in Venice, that kind of irritated me because I wanted to write these articles about Reagan or what was happening, politically more in the broad spectrum. And but then I realized the Beachhead started as a community voice, and way back in the late 60s, and pretty much we've retained that tradition.
Linda mentioned the Alternative Press Syndicate in a number of the graphics a while ago. The Alternative Press Syndicate has been dead for about a year and a half. The Liberation News Service is no longer with us. But a number of the papers still exchange with the Beachhead. We still get exchanges from as far away as the Lancaster Independent Press in Pennsylvania, LIP as they call it, the Bloomington paper. It's the Post-American with a K from the old 60s edition of America. So there really is a community not just like us, but it is a national community. There are people out there. And as Patrick mentioned, we even had Jeff correspondents from Europe. We've had other Europeans send us material. I believe at one time a few years ago we had a man from Greece send something, a Greek fellow. I forgot what his rap was, but he was aware of the Beachhead. So there are still people like us out there. And I spent 6 years not writing. I came to Venice, and my first article that was printed in the Beachhead under my pen name of Memphis Slim, my real name's Larry Sullivan, incidentally, we got a letter from Recon Publications in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is the reprinter of many leftist publications that are printed outside the United States. They were the first journal to ever reprint General Giap's book, How We Won the War, after the entire country of Vietnam was liberated. Anyway, the publisher sent the Beachhead a note and said, "Dear Memphis Slim, glad to see you back in print again." And so I know there are people just like us all over the United States, and they still read the Beachhead.
Okay. Now I have a question about how duties get divided up and what categories of duties are there, what categories. So I'd like some comments about various time periods. I can just briefly comment about the mid-70s, my time period. Everybody did everything, and we would rotate. Everyone was responsible for some selling ads. I, as I said, had to drive to the printer because I had the car. But we all did paste up. We all thought of titles for the articles. We all distributed. Everyone had to do everything. And I'd just like to know how it has been at various other times.
Well, that's a good theory, but when in practice, I think, like myself, I haven't been too active with ads. I am not good at selling ads, and I think I've taken some leads on the telephone because now our phone number is on the Beachhead masthead, and I've given them to somebody else, because I always thought I would fuck them up or you know, I thought I'll take the telephone number, and basically I haven't been good in that department. At one time I was the typing pool. I was typing all the articles, so that was my contribution. And also I think there are other people who we tried to do everything, but some people tended to go in one way or another, and that's basically
it. Speaking on different duties and how they're, say, divvied up, it's sort of, with the Beachhead, in my last 4.5 some odd years experience, I've seen things fall to the people that are most willing and or most capable of doing a given thing. I sort of took over let the typesetting committee meet at my home when Mo Stavnazer decided that he was tired of having had it there for the last 2 or 3 years or whatever, and that evolved into what we called for a while the Sisterhood Plus One, which was Carol Fondiller, myself, and Patrick. And between us and Precision Press, basically we got most of the headlines done, and then we got even poorer, back to the old money rap again. And we discovered a franchise place called Alpha Graphics. So for quite a while, we were getting together, taking the headlines that the collective had, proposed and done at the meeting, and then just taking our given lists, usually Patrick and myself, to Alpha Graphics and doing it there on the printer, right there on the spot, and saving us a great deal of money. It didn't hurt that the lady there liked us a lot too and kept cutting us bargains and stuff. I've since then have developed a serious sensitivity to the fluorocarbons in the place, and as in the collective process I see now, I've basically passed it along. Once Patrick left, Rex joined me, and now I've done my Emily Winters trip all full circle and recruited someone else to kind of take over in the fluorocarbon department, and the headlines still look pretty damn good. Basically, that's how things happen on the Beachhead. That's one of the reasons we're not big in the money department, because none of us feel very good or adept at selling ads.
The actual distribution of the paper, when the flats are laid out, as Linda was talking about it on her living room floor, well, they're laid out on our living room table and dining room table now. But I'm the person that takes them to the printer. We now have a printer for a number of years, have had a printer in Glendale. And Rex, who's not here with us today, picks the paper up and brings it back. And a bunch of people here that you see right now, as well as a number of other unnamed individuals, do the distribution. We still put out 10,000 issues a month, too.
Has it ever missed a month?
Well, see, when we were starting to prepare for the 20th anniversary, we were told by old hands that the paper had never missed an issue. Then, with simple inspection of the volume number, we discovered that, yes, perhaps there were a few issues that had been missed somewhere in the dusty recesses of time. Since then, the archive effort that's been made as part of this 20th anniversary has uncovered which months those were, and they were in the dim past. I think perhaps for the last 10 years the Beachhead has not missed a monthly publication. But I wanted to comment on the selection method. It's always it's a wonderful miracle of publication, a volunteer publication where there's none of the writers are expecting anything but to have their personal viewpoints splashed across a publication. That come the first issue, the first meeting of the month, the second meeting of the month out of 3, there will be an outpouring of article ideas and actual contributions by people on the collective, and then those people in the community or even farther away who know of our publishing schedule. And I must say that sometimes the best issues that we have published, in my opinion, were when we received twice as much as we could publish. And when you start throwing out the lower priority articles, and we would be forced to create first priority and second priority articles if we had more than we could publish, the paper all of a sudden started to become extremely interesting. And for about a 2-year period out of the 4 years that I was active, it was like that. We would almost always have twice as much material as we could afford to publish. Perhaps if we had better funds, we could have published even those other articles, but many times they would get published in the long run. They would be held back from month to month and eventually see print. So it was an interesting accommodation to the limitations of space, the prioritization of the articles. And as Diane mentioned, we'd usually try and include...
I met Steve Clare and Judy Goldberg and I guess Sarah Lonsman and I don't remember all. John Haig was already out, I think, of the collective that time. I met him at the Save the Canals Committee. I was walking through the canals or somewhere in Venice. I heard some music and I followed the music and ended up in the middle of a fundraiser, eating corn on the cob and other things. It's all sort of like one big memory. Those were really good times when, as I said, I felt Venice was really under attack. And as I recall, the paper came out depending on money, whether they had money, and a lot would depend on, or the money question would also determine the size of the paper, whether it would be 4 pages, 8 pages, 12 pages was unheard of. To put out a 12-page paper was really like an exception, and sometimes we would try to make that sort of an exception when there was a very good article. And they generally always would have more articles than they could print. And it was almost when the backlog of articles was just too much and there was too much good stuff to put out that an effort was made by people who were very busy in a telephone switchboard. We had like a hotline working out of the community house in the canals and the co-op, and I forget how many all things were going on, and everybody was busy doing other things, and they would just sort of knock out the paper, like, just knock it out. And I think you were...
Well, I think that one of the things that's a benefit of the Beachhead is totally separate from, maybe not totally, but in many ways is separate from its journalistic quality and how it was put together, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the fact that it is and has been the voice within the community, and it helps sustain the community, single-mindedness, instead of having it get fractured or dissipate. It has been a cohesive factor in the continued existence of that value system, and that's its greater accomplishment.
In the 20 years that the Beachhead's been published, to my knowledge, we have not yet been sued for libel, but we came close several times during the 4 years that I was on the collective. But with a certain amount of profuse apologies, some free legal advice from Steve Clare, an occasional correction or two. Several letters of apology. Well, see, most of the people who complained about the Beachhead and perhaps had some mind of legal recourse after being either slandered or made to feel unwanted, eventually learned that the Beachhead has no resources, is not incorporated, has no identifiable individual who owns a house or has other recoverable assets. So although the Beachhead has committed almost every sin a newspaper is capable of, including copious liberation of other people's work, cartoons, graphics, photographs, even articles, not always attributed. In fact, I'm one of the worst offenders, and I know what a transgression it is. We have managed to be just that type of beyond the pale, outlaw, underground, real, genuine.
Victor brought up something that I noticed, and the videotape will show that you see mostly white faces over here. One of the things that I'm proudest of, the last issue, which by present standards was quite small, was only 8 pages, but we had 4 major articles, none of which was written by an actual Caucasian individual. 3 of the authors were of Mexican-American descent, and 1 of the individuals was black. So, and this, I believe, is the first issue that I've ever been on, at least, where, as they say, an entire third world publication or an issue came out.
that was always an issue in my mid-70s. We were always trying to bring on people of color and print articles by people of color, and we weren't always very successful. For some reason, Venice in the 70s became a white community in terms of the political activism, unfortunately. But we did always do outreach. We did print articles by, and I was talking to Ed about this earlier, by Redbird, who, to our knowledge, was a Native American woman. And we never met Redbird, but she did write about what was going on in the Native American community. A woman by the name of Rachel Drano. Remember Rachel Drano? Used to bring the articles, so I was never really sure if she was writing them or she convinced us that it was really a Native American woman. But we made an effort, always tried to expand our ranks in that area, unsuccessfully, I might say. Well, we had Milton Takai, who was Japanese American, who was on the staff when I joined. I just wanted to bring up some of the names that keep coming into my head now. We have, we're all here, but there's a lot of people who've participated over the years. Maybe we could all go around and kind of regurgitate some names of some very special people. Gordon Quinlan was on the staff for a long time, a poet. I don't know whatever happened to him. He's not been heard from for many years, but he was very special. And I mentioned Peter and Roy, and I can't remember their last names. I'm blanking out right now. I'll come back. Does anyone else want to mention names of people?
Well, I'd like to go back a little bit, and because I was born in Mexico, but I really have always felt rather embarrassed to say I'm Mexican, because I feel like I'm a token almost, and most of these things. And I just said, wait a minute, I don't really want to, be the token, but.
There's two of you now.
You're the token.
I'm full. I think people find it hard to believe that I was born in Mexico and not of American parents, but of Mexican parents. And there's always been a lot of activism in Venice, not always white, but certainly the Beachhead has always been of the workers, primarily, white. But that has always been an important value. Forgot what else I was going to say.
Names of people?
Names of people. Well, this is more of a column that you've already mentioned, Jim Zane. Jim Zane lobotomy column.
It was so bad. It was so bad.
I liked it, but everybody.
I didn't like it.
That was a very different.
Dr.
Zane's lobotomy column. There were many different collectives, and I think one collective that hasn't been mentioned at all is the most political one, I think, which was Doug Marshall, and that all those people, they lived on 29th and Dell.
Was that the Marxist?
Well, I did. Pardon me? Bread and Roses, the Bread and Roses collective.
What years were these?
Before you, just before you. In fact, they also they got complaints that nobody was reading the Beachhead because they were so politically correct.
That was so boring.
They were so politically correct that they finally listened to the groundswell and said, well, okay, who wants it?
Oh,
And that's when you guys took over.
Well, it had been taken over, and then I kind of came.
Okay, well, that was the history. Just before you did,
Yeah.
they dropped it. And it's happened several times that people who turned over the paper to people they really didn't like and felt very politically opposed to, but, they listened to, there was time to move on.
Well, Milton Takai was very politically correct. He was very, and I believe he lives in Santa Barbara now and writes on the alternative press there. But he was, I think he was communist, and his articles were very, very correct. And he was a very dear person, but one of the humorless ones. And,
He still occasionally.
yes, he is. He's wonderful, wonderful dear person. Other names of people.
I want to mention democratic centralism with regards to Milton Takai. That's all. He wasn't a communist. He was
okay.
a democratic centralist who saw himself as a warrior.
Well, there are two names. One is Mo, of course, who has contributed such a great deal, who's not here at this group at the moment. The other person's name I was thinking of, in a way, I associate with maybe the Beachhead's biggest social success or most significant social success, aside from the local scene in Venice, and that was Wendy Reeves and the Greenie obsession. which was a Venice woman who had a man became fixated on her and just loved her and 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 wouldn't let her go, and what resulted was her writing the article and a screenwriter seeing the article in the Beachhead and it becoming a TV movie of the week and a California state law about people harassing people and extending your rights based on I'm not sure exactly what the legal concepts were that they did it, but it expanded a TRO, which previous to that was the most that you could get to restrain somebody from annoying you, and she enlarged that law as a result of the experience and as a result of that becoming known from the Beachhead articles. So
For the uninformed, what is a TRO?
A temporary restraining order. This man was just absolutely psychotic, and I know that a member of the LAPD, if you're listening for the other comments, I know there was a member of the LAPD who came up to Wendy and said, Wendy, just give us the word and we'll take this guy off the end of the pier and you'll never see him again. Because the police were frustrated, she was frustrated, she was being harassed, it was incredible, and they just said, we'll take care of him if you want. But I think that law now protects a number of women, in particular, in the state of California, who are the subject of psychotic male obsession. And I think that's a great accomplishment for the largest end.
Yes, and a little sidelight of that last story is that the person who was obsessed moved to Santa Barbara and still contributes on occasion some excellent poetry. I won't mention his name because of the circumstances, but or should I, for the posterity? There it is, collective vote. But I'd like to add a couple more names to the collection. People like Emily Winters is both in graphics and writing. Several of the perhaps difficult temperaments who have contributed brilliant articles during the time I was associated with it was John Dover and Bob Rifkin. Those two gentlemen helped me understand that sometimes the funniest writing is done by some of the more tortured personalities. And that was certainly driven home to me by those guys. Bob Rifkin was my neighbor that I dragged along to the first meeting, and he was kicked off the collective about 5 or 6 months later for general depression. And I'd like to throw a little bouquet towards Druid Tim, wherever he is. And one of my greatest regrets is that we were not able to keep contributions from Tim from coming. He was a hilarious writer. He wrote Druid Scopes and other generally silly articles. And he's typical of the, we've talked about the ethnic mix of the staffs. In most of the time that I've served on the staff, it's been largely Jewish and Irish. And I won't tell you which one I am. But the reason I chose Eddie Ogoy as a nom de plume was partly because of Carol's use of Essie de la Yenta as a nom de plume. Who else? Well, those are the principal names. If I remember anybody else, I'll bring them up.
I'd like to say some more about Wendy Reeves because she was the person who I originally was contacted by to join the collective, and with all the sensationalism about her harassment case, it gets overlooked that she was a multi-talented woman who wrote articles, took photographs, and did the production on all her own articles, and she even gave those sections of the Beachhead that she wrote for a look. In terms of those people who would like the Beachhead to look a little more professional, well, she did have the chops for that. She did these beautiful layouts of her articles, as well as some other people's articles, but for her own, she would do these very professional-looking setups. She would take the photographs of the people that she wrote about, and she had an interest in doing these profiles on people in Venice, artists and other people doing interesting things, so she would do feature-length articles complete with photographs of them. And she was feeling a lot of fulfillment with this work, which unfortunately her personal problems got in the way of, so she had to leave Venice and leave the Beachhead. And I hope that someday she could resurface somewhere, even if she has to do it under another name, I don't know, but the hope is that her talents will eventually show up somewhere, because I felt she was a very inspirational person while she was on the collective. And I also liked, although they didn't write that often, Brenda Harney and Olga Pello, both of whom are not here. They were both very important people on the collective the first time I was on it, because they gave me a lot of the perspective on what the political issues were that they were interested in. And maybe there was a lot of dominance in those days of people involved in the Venice Town Council, because they were involved in that. But at least they were there to explain to you what the issues were. And so they were more of I think, a kind of ethical force at the Beachhead in those days, as well as very much involved in the energy of putting out the paper. And they were always very eager to get an article typeset, to get something organized. I'm sorry that neither of them are here today to be involved in this, as they know so much of the history of the paper also.
I wanted to comment just quickly on Bob Wells, a little kudo. I don't think he ever was on the collective, but he was okay, before me probably, but he was certainly an integral part of the Venice in the 70s that I'm aware of. So a little kudo to Bob.
I just wanted to say, because I know he'll never forgive us if we don't mention the Peace and Freedom Party, and John Haig. He was one of the original founders of the Beachhead, and right, and Martha, the support group, and that's all I want to say.
Any other names?
Kelly Ball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think I know how the Beachhead was founded, the original story. Does anyone know the story of the beginning?
I think
of the
it
Beachhead?
started in the coffee shop. I mean, I've heard the story about how John Haig had a coffee house over there. Does anybody remember?
Yes,
Dudley.
Dudley,
And everybody would go in there and they would talk, and basically it was, P&F supposedly got founded there, and also P&F wanted a voice of the community. At first they talked about having, publishing pamphlets or something, and then someone got the idea that it should be a newspaper, and that's how the Free Venice Beachhead got started, in a coffee house.
I just had a memory. This wasn't directly related to the Beachhead, but we did print an article about it. In the mid-'70s, it was a very heavy women's movement in Venice, and it was very strong and very intense. And there was a street woman whose name escapes me. I'm sure we all remember her, and I can't think of her name, who was beaten up and raped by 3 local men. And that evening, about 35 or 40 women converged at the end of my block on Wavecrest and met in my house. Yeah, I think it might have been. No, it wasn't her. It was another one, and I see her, but the name escapes me. And we met in my house, and we decided to go after. This was just a spontaneous meeting. We decided to go after the 3 guys because we knew where they were. We by consensus, we asked the women in the room if how many of them if any of them had ever been raped, and about half the women had raised their hand and said they had never talked about it. And we decided not to be violent, but to make a lot of noise. And about 30 or so of us walked out of my house and walked down to the boardwalk and en masse walked down the beach to I'm trying to think of the name of the street. It's where the Marina Pacific is, the other side of Marina Pacific, where Joe's Clam House now is, where the sushi place used to be. Okay, and and there still is an apartment building there, and the guys were in there, and we took pots and pans and clatter, and we made a huge amount of noise, and the cops came and didn't know what to do with us because they had no language for a group of 30 women marching down the boardwalk. And we surrounded the apartment and started yelling and screaming. And we decided to deface the door only because it wasn't their property, it was a rental, but we did put rapist on the door. And the next thing we heard was that one of them committed himself to a Camarillo or someplace, and many of us showed up at the arraignment of another. And it was a really amazing, spontaneous event. And after that, we formed patrols, and groups of women would patrol the boardwalk. For a long time after that, I don't remember how we signed up, but we took turns walking 4 or 5 abreast, very heavily down the boardwalk to protect other women. It was interesting, and we did write about it in the Beachhead.
One of the things that I'm going to be missing that I already missed of the Beachhead is that in the entire time that I worked for the Beachhead, we were given space gratis above the Fox International in Venice. And it was a wonderful workspace, although the person who shared the facilities with us wouldn't agree. But we used it for 3 days a month by courtesy of the Raul Morrow, who had the lease, Cumberland Film Company, is it? And it was a wonderfully atmospheric location. It wasn't the best work facilities. We did not have good tables and chairs and so forth. There was far too much hands and knees type of work. But then during the winter, when it would get dark before we were finished with paste up, and the neon marquee of the Fox International would light up, it was, I can think of no finer place to have produced a newspaper. Sadly, that work site has been lost to the Beachhead, and although we have been given some workspace, now notice I said we, and I've been off the Beachhead for a few months now, has been given free space by the Tenant Action Center and the old collective member Steve Clare, but it could still use another Fox International as he said. Just the plastic base.
I read the Beachhead when I first moved to Venice. I saw some copies in a liquor store, Davy Jones Liquor Locker, one of our supporters. And then I found out where the meetings were held and thought, oh, these must be young teeny boppers, as we used to say, but I'll check it out. Actually, I had sent a poem, rejected, by Patrick McCartney. Got a little... So I thought, I'm going to check this place out, you know? So I walked in, and at that time, the Beachhead met above the Fox Venice. There were all these people sitting around, relaxed, and they were my generation. So I got very excited, and I thought, I've been in Southern California for 12 years, and finally I find a group where I feel really comfortable. And maybe we have some things in common and we can do something. So I started then, and that was less than 2 years ago. But I've enjoyed it very much, and I think the Beachhead is really an important thing these days, with local Venice issues being so important, you know, and people talking about secession, and the question of these elections. I mean, and the end of our century. My God, it's time for a new decade of the '60s, only even better, a little more responsible, maybe. So yeah, and we have to give an example to other people to get involved and participate, or nothing is going to change.
Are you up to Venice Sketch 25 now, Beth?
I finished the Venice sketches. I'm doing rewrites. They rejected my very last and best one, but I'm hopeful that it will be published.
Somebody that I just finally remembered his name, but who was a very long-time supporter of the Beachhead and an advertiser for a number of years, and has helped us raise money at various times, and that is Will, the owner of the Come Back Inn. He has been a long-time community supporter in Venice, and he certainly was one of the very, very old advertisers, but eventually, due to his financial situation, Will Robb is his name? Okay. Rabe, I'm sorry.
I was going to say also Bob and Anita Alexander.
Yeah.
Venice wouldn't be Venice without them. And also Mary Jane and the Canal people. And my memories of thank you, Mary Jane, for doing this today. But you're always Canal woman, Mary Jane, to me. And I remember the Canal festivals and the Canal funeral, and you were it. There was also a man named Ron who lived in the canals, who moved up to Northern California. Ron Gunther was very, very important to the old Beachhead as well.
What I wanted to mention is that the Beachhead continues to function, and as a matter of fact, we really do need to bring this to a close soon, because we have a Beachhead collective for this month's meeting to go to very soon.
I'd like to say something. If there are any volunteers out there who have some extra time, please get in touch with us. You can find our phone number in the masthead. And the telephone number is 399-0584. And post office box is 504. Okay? Venice. 90294. Right. Okay. So hopefully we'll see you there.
Viva la Beachhead. Thank you.
A pickup shot.
Ginny Peary.
Can someone mention some of these people?
Can
Pickup
you turn it on for another minute?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, it's on. We keep remembering, and we're going to be doing this for hours and days, of people that we haven't mentioned. But we Mary Lou Johnson, Kate Keeling,
Elizabeth Elder.
Kathleen Alvarez.
Ginny Peary.
Kate Keeling. Oh, we said that.
And her husband.
Sue. I can't remember Sue's last name. Sue Baker. No, Sue Baker. But there's another one. But there's another Sue who worked with Joan Freeberg when I was on, and I'm very bad with names today. My
We
mind
should
is.
mention Kathleen, who's now Alvarez. Okay.
Chuck.
Bloomquist.
Chuck Bloomquist.
Chuck Bloomquist.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Larry Abrams, briefly during our tenure. Also, John of the new Beachhead, John, what's his last name? John S. John Swearingen was active for a short time. Rex Frankel has become almost indispensable despite his archaic political opinions. Judith L. Martin, who is a very productive contributor right now. Who else is? Sarah Omari, who is a prolific writer, and Rick Davidson, who was also a prolific writer. Marge Buckley. Judy Goldberg, we have mentioned briefly. Steve Clare, we've mentioned repeatedly and deserves as much mention as all those at the Tenant Action Center. Susan Millman.
All the volunteers that delivered the Beachhead. Be Free, Arlene Handler.
Yes,
But
and
also there are various times have been actually networks that have distributed the Beachhead to all their neighborhoods.
All those names, known and unknown.
Unknown. I mean, because always.
And all of the.
It comes out in the paper every month, but the way the paper is presented every month, the way the paper comes together, and if you were to come to any one of our meetings, you wouldn't believe it. You would not believe that anybody can actually put together a paper under the conditions which we do. But we decided, number one, there was no editor, and number two, that the workers, i.e. those people who typed, those people who collected money from the ads, those people who also wrote, those people who took the Beachhead to its non-union printer in Glendale, but he's giving us credit. He's really, and they come out on time, and sometimes there have been problems in the past with printers who would refuse to print us. T-shirts and the next day, excuse me, ma'am, spare dime, quarters are going, a quarter, right? Okay, we can do that sort of thing, and really, improve the, appearance of the oceanfront walk that way, which is what most of the people are now. The Venice Action Committee is busy planting Australian willows on Rose Avenue. This is what their thing is now, which of course will make Rose Avenue just a little bit narrower than it is right now, So you'll have to walk through it single file. They also want to get rid of the truckas, which are, these marvelous places where you can get, nice produce and stuff like that, and a seafood salad or what have you, off the truck. Well, they don't want that either because it's, quote, undesirable, So we've been through this with the Venice Action Committee. And we also have what we call the local coastal plan. And I mean, there are so many initiatives in Venice. We've got the LCP, we've got the LIP, which is Land Implementation something or other. We've got the LUP, which is land use. We've got the ICO, which is interim control ordinance, which is supposed to keep buildings down while we design. But of course, there are always hardship exemptions for the developers because they really will lose money if they don't build. So they get through, because they have hardship exemptions, right? I have never heard of one person in this room, for instance, have you ever said when you parked your car anywhere, in spite of the fact that the Beachhead, we finally, in a way, got respectability. I remember the first time that we handed out, I got arrested for handing out the Beachhead one time. They claimed to have found pills on me, which weren't true, except maybe birth control pills, but I don't even think then. I'd lost all hope by that time. But, I wanted to be spontaneous. I'm sure I'll have to. But, that's another thing that we've got to thank, Bush and Reagan for, really, when you think about it. They want governments off our backs, and they want, but they it came upon our midnight clear, that glorious burst of hope. Oh, I was talking in my path, the heat was in the cold. Then through the door, the boys in blue came crashing through my path. So in a flash I flushed my hash, the only stash I had. One of the things about the Beachhead, we always think, is it really going to last? The first time I remember we looked at it, and said, wow, we didn't even think about it lasting for 20 years or lasting for 10. We just wanted to get out the news. But we knew we'd achieved something when we went down to City Hall to protest yet another depredation on our fair little anarchate of Venice. And that was, when we stood up there, and all of a sudden Arthur Snyder, who I'm sure it was a planning committee. Now, in the city of Los Angeles, you've got to remember that it's this huge. I always like to do this because, unfortunately, it's still true. One time, one of our ex-collective members, Bob Wells, wherever you are in Chicago,
Thank you.
My thoughts are with you. But he said one time that this was the national anthem of Venice, and I, in an excess of optimism, said, no. Anyway, the chorus is, too poor to live here, too poor to live here, too poor to live here. The land speculators are grabbing my home, so I gotta leave Venice and roam. I used to live in the trailer court with friends and buddies I used to consort. The rent was cheap and the air was free, but they say that sunshine is too good for me, 'cause I'm too poor to live here, too poor to live here, too poor to live here. The land speculators are grabbing my home, and I gotta leave Venice and roam. I had a pad on the Howard Canal. The place was good for my morale. As I was feeding the ducks one day, a big bulldozer tried to chase me away, 'cause I'm too poor to live here, too poor to live here, too poor to live here. My speculators are grabbing my home, and I gotta leave Venice and roam. They're gonna have a parking lot, and where you live there'll be a yacht. I'm too Well, you know. I mean, we have to
John Hinckley shot the president, Hinckley came out for gun control, and Reagan came out against it. It's a combination of smegma and plaque between the lobes of the brain. Growing some kind of fungus there. That's why they have that plaster on his hair now to keep the fungus from sprouting out. So, it's strange. So now we have a sort of a spillover, sort of Teflon spillover on the Bush. It's really very bizarre because, first of all, they said he had a whip image, right? Here's a guy who ran the CIA, had 47 covert actions going with Jonestown as a bonus. And you never got a mile. Is it? I guess it is. Oh, well, let's Kool-Aid for everybody. So there it was. Bush wants to overcome his whip image. So what does he do? He flies. Remember this girl, Jessica McClure, the most poignant story of last year. She was in a well for 3 days. Nobody knew she was dead or alive. And now, of course, they're fighting over the movie contract. So it shows that there's redemption to everything. And George Bush, to show he's not a whip, flies there at 4:30 in the morning to Midland, Texas, and stands by little Jessica's bedside for 15 minutes while she's sleeping. But it's a great photo opportunity. And then he had the audacity to say this child was rescued because of the American spirit. Now, what are the implications of that? A third world country would have thrown her back? Russia, the evil empire, would not only have left her, they would have thrown dirt on top of her? So he's just, but the big thing, the carryover is going to be, see, the one blessing, I'm already reaching the blessing in disguise stage, because all the shit that's going to hit the fan, the economy, the Iran-Contra, Noriega, it's all going to be at least while Bush is in office. So that mild conflict. But of course he's impeachment-proof. Well, so they're mentioned. So, you can do it in the middle. What's your answer? Appropriate question. Peck. Oh no, I think that things are going to be so rotten that people will see that the wool has been pulled over their eyes. Just like Johnson didn't get reelected and had to quit, you know. So I think he set a wonderful precedent. Well, I'm very optimistic, but I have chromosome damage. Oh, well, I used to have short-term memory. filled to the brim with cocaine. And this was while the Reagan administration was having its anti-cocaine public relations campaign. And William Casey, of course, was just concerned about the radar screen. So that while Nancy was saying, just say no, the CIA was saying, just fly low. So the thing is, indulgent group thing. So if Bush would speak before an Italian group, he says, yes, we have Antonin Scalia in the Supreme Court. You know, just all this pigeonholing. He spoke before a group of Hispanics, and he said, I promise I'm elected, I'll appoint a Hispanic to my cabinet. Of course, now he's elected, but you know, he never keeps his word. He even said that he never said voodoo economics, and yet there are TV clips of him saying it. So we know now that he's elected, he'll say, no, I meant if I was elected, I would hire an Hispanic to build the cabinet for me. He has this pure ability to make a virtue of anything, you know? I mean, there's lots of evidence that he has this mistress somewhere in Washington. Now, but he defends, he said, well, look at Barbara, can you blame me? He just justifies everything. He justifies the fact that Quayle had this National Guard scandal by saying, look, the reason we have a war hero such as myself and a draft author such as Quayle is because the Republicans want to present America with a balanced ticket. See? So, yeah, balance. And then there was a gender gap. Now here's a guy, Bush, who had no concept. I mean, he thought he would have Quayle to get the women's vote, even though he voted against ERA, was against abortion rights, and looks like a combination of Robert Redford and Daffy Duck. Anyway, the one line, I said, what kind of stuff do you want? And they said, we want self-deprecatory humor. So I said, okay, how's this? You can have Dukakis say, if what Mr. Bush says is true, I'll go swimming in Boston Harbor. Well, no, that's a little too self-deprecating. Okay, let me give you the better pitch. How about this? If what Mr. Bush says is true, I'll go walking across Boston Harbor. I said, no, that was even worse. So they called back the next day, the day before the debate, and they said we're desperate. I have to emphasize that, we're desperate. I said, okay, how's this? Mr. Bush keeps saying I'm a card-carrying member of the ACLU. But I'm a dyslexic, and I thought he said I was a member of UCLA. So they kind of thought that was cute, but I think they were afraid of losing the dyslexic vote. They chickened out because it's very organized now, you know. The dyslexic slogan is, dyslexics of the world untied. You have nothing to do with your balance. Actually, they misunderstood the whole point. If a dyslexic votes for Bush, that would be a vote for Dukakis. Entirely. So he only used one line of it in the debate, and if it wasn't mine, it was something like a flexible phrase that sounds like an economic Slurpee. You know? But I'll tell you, I came to understand why Bush beat Dukakis, and it had to do with something I learned in New York recently. I did a show at Lincoln Center with Allen Ginsberg, who he was accompanied by Philip Glass, who's a New Age musician. New Age music is sort of like Muzak, but without the melody. And Karen Finley was there. Has anybody here heard of Karen Finley? She's a performance artist and a poet, but she's most infamous for shoving candy jams up her tushy. Now, does that ring a bell? So I was hoping I wouldn't have to follow her. And Allen Ginsberg was very disappointed because he thought she was going to shove a sweet potato up his ass. Very much like the character that Robert De Niro played in The King of Comedy. You remember that guy who was just a comedy, a conscious nut? And this guy was very decent, real people who were like that. He kept telling me joke after joke after joke, one joke after another. I'll give you an example. He said, okay, here's a real good joke. I said, okay, go ahead. I braced myself. He said, what is scarier than a pit bull with AIDS? Oh, a lot. He says, the guy who gave it to him. I appreciate those roads, I really do. Because it shows that this is not a laugh track. Governor Dukakis, if your wife, Kitty, this was the personalizer, so it's not just that your wife, anybody. So if your wife, Kitty, were raped and murdered, how would you feel about the death penalty? Now, you would have thought that Dukakis would have said, well, I would strangle him. You know, I would be so furious, but this is a nation of laws, and the state has the right to execute somebody just because they have the power. But instead, he just started reciting his Social Security number or something. Whereas, just a programmed response, like you press his death penalty button and just give this programmed response. Not responding to the moment or to the question. Whereas when the same pregnant tomorrow, how would you feel about the abortion law then? Because these guys, yeah, I know, but you never know. One of those spermatozoa made of taking steroids. It's really coming in there. It's his mother! Huh? It's his mother! It's his mother? No. Look, the first thing that happened when he got elected is they put his wife's picture on the dollar bill. That's a misuse of power. So, I saw you going like this before. Yeah. Oh, this is how see, it's very important these days to learn how to tell the difference between watching the news and dreaming. It's getting harder and harder to tell. That's the way. You flap your arms like wings. If you fly, you're just dreaming it. So, forget the lights are on television. It's getting harder and harder to tell the difference between a sound bite and a massive flashback. So I saw on television Surgeon General Coop. Remember, what's his? General Coop, the funny beard. And he was taking a pipe away from Mr. Potato Head. I figured I went like this for that. And I remained stationary. So I knew it was a real story. You can do this. I've done this for a long time. I visited the University of Texas in Austin where they had the sniper, the guy who climbed up the tower there, with an air-powered rifle to shoot people. And he had a knapsack with extra ammunition and rope and a blanket and clothing and food and water and an underarm deodorant stick. I couldn't figure that out. I mean, here's a guy who was going to go and kill people at random, but he didn't want to offend. Even this guy now, the Colombian drug kingpin, Carlos Letter, who's in prison for it, he brought in 80% of the coke into this country. He's now in prison in Florida for life plus 135 years, or 135 years plus life, whichever is worse, they gave him. And so it said they interviewed him in his prison cell, and he said his two heroes were John Lennon and Adolf Hitler. How do you reconcile that? A man of peace who's a wonderful musician, and a madman who orchestrated the Holocaust. Does Carlos Letter go around his prison cell singing, "Imagine no Jews"? You need a scorecard. So a 12-year-old girl from Children's Express asked Dan Quayle, if my father raped me and I became pregnant, then could I get an abortion? And Dan Quayle says no. And she says, but my life would be ruined. He says, you could get counseling. A heartbeat away, that's all it is. I mean, they have a life support system in the White House, just waiting behind the curtain, just in case. People on any point.
benefit at the Sidewalk Cafe on November 17th, and that's Marge Buckley and Steve Clare, who could not make it to the panel discussions in the backyard at Rick's, but they're here at this benefit tonight. The benefit's now over. Carol Fondiller, County Peck,
to us for tonight's benefit by Bob Goodfader.